this invitation. I was very happy that I would be given the opportunity to be talking about my work. And well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone, or for some, it probably is good morning rather. And as a clinical psychologist, I'm very much interested in what could go wrong in terms of learning or decision-making processes that could actually be causing clinical symptoms that we see in patients. So this talk will be a bit less technical, but a bit more focused on the clinical aspects and how, when studying those, sequential sampling models could be helpful. So, well, first of all, motivations are actually pervasively shaping our everyday actions and largely impact our decisions as well. And well, you could even say that certain response tendencies, they're almost biologically hardwired into our system. And maybe one of the most prominent examples is that we are usually very prone to be behaviorally activated by the outlook of reward, or for instance, a cupcake or chocolate. So that is rather a very strong urge to approach such a reward. Another example from the social domain would actually be that most of us are very likely to have this urge of once in a while hugging your friends or family. However, at the same time, at least recently, given the pandemic, this has not been such a good idea. So you were actually asked to not do that, or to at least reduce this, and to actually stay more away from people, to rather isolate yourself. So you were actually asked to do the opposite of behaviorally approaching something, but actually to inhibit this approach behavior and in light of a reward. And I'm assuming that, as for me, that didn't really come naturally to most of us, because that's actually something that is not in our system. We usually do the opposite. And this kind of reactive pattern or response tendency is rather hard for us to suppress this urge. And this is what I mean when I will be talking henceforth about motivational biases, because we are biased that certain response tendencies are easier for us to execute than others, such as the cupcake and the non-hugging example. And probably it doesn't come to you as a surprise when I now tell you that, at least for quite a range of psychiatric disorders, motivational biases have actually been affected or have been shown to be altered. And that these disorders, that's quite a range. So it was shown for mood and anxiety disorders, but also for schizophrenia and also compulsivity and addictions. At the same time, recently, there has been quite a debate about whether only focusing on psychiatric patient samples is really the right way to go when you are investigating the underlying mechanisms, both in terms of behavior and biology, when looking at clinical symptoms. And that was because a lot of people said, well, you know, psychiatric disorders, they're rather artificial categories that are set by our diagnostic systems, such as the DSM-5 or ICD-10. And it was actually proposed that it might be good to not abolish psychiatric patient research, but also add examining clinical symptoms in a dimensional way. So basically have a look at how clinical symptoms across the whole spectrum, from non-clinical to very high pathological states, might behave or might be associated with cognitive constructs. Because actually there's quite a wide range of clinical symptoms to be found in general population samples. And this was actually the reason why we wanted to look at motivational biases and their association with clinical symptoms, not in a patient sample, but in a general population sample. So we'll tell you more about what kind of study we did for that. So we did an online study with roughly 500 participants, and we let them do some cognitive tasks, and we also let them do an already established battery of clinical questionnaires that was first, in that way suggested by Gillen and colleagues in 2016, but has been quite often used since then. And then I will tell you now more about how we measure motivational biases in the lab. Because we do that with a so-called motivational go-no-go task. Probably some of you will be already familiar with it. It has been around for a while. So how do we test motivational biases? I already told you about 2 different response tendencies we have. One being rather simple, namely the approaching a reward, or what we call a no-go to win, coupling or pairing. And then we also have the opposite, the no-go to win, which is basically the corona and non-hugging example I just told you about. But to really test motivational biases, we really need to have test all combinations. So basically, we not just have to look at go responses and in the context of reward, but also do the same for the punishment context and when people are actually better off in not doing anything. So we have a reinforcement learning task, which actually captures just that. So we measure all of these 4 squares from all of those 4 categories from the square that I'm depicting here, and we ask people to learn by trial and error for each cue that we are showing to them, whether it's better to show a response by pressing a button or not. So it's really a simple task in that way that it just has 2 response options. And these 2 options that are surrounded by the orange edge, that's actually the so-called bias congruent categories. And these are the categories that are really rather easy for us to execute, whereas the opposite ones are rather a tough one. So when we look at the data now, when we look at how people do the task and how they perform, what you see is that in terms of the choice data, we see that people can actually successfully learn the task. So probability of making a go response depicted on the y-axis here is considerably higher for go cues than compared to no-go cues, where you shouldn't really show any go response at all. But given the probabilistic nature of the task, people still do show a go response once in a while. When you look at the RT data, you also see this difference for go and no-go cues. Basically, that tells you that people, whenever showing a correct go response, people are just faster, as depicted by the smaller orange bar here, and they just take longer for incorrect go responses, which makes sense. So, but that doesn't tell us yet anything about the motivational biases in decision-making. So for that, we actually need to split up the go and the no-go cues according to valence. So according to win and avoid cues. And when you do that, you can actually see this difference depicted by the orange arrows here between the win cues, which are the green bars, and the punishment or avoid punishment cues, which are here the red bars. And come to think of it, it doesn't really make sense that for a simple response, either showing a go or no-go response, that the outcome of a cue should really affect it that much, how we acquire this response or how successful and accurate we are. The fact that this is actually what we see is what we usually call, this difference is usually what we call motivational biases in decision-making. You can also see this very similar effect when you look at the RT data. So again, this very strong valence effect, or it's not as strong as for the choice data, but we do see that also for the RT data when you look at this difference. Overall, again, no-go cues, whenever you show an incorrect go response, you just take longer overall, but you still have this valence effect there as well. But how can we characterize now the clinical symptoms? Because that's something we need to do before we investigate their association with motivational biases. So we had a look at the entire clinical battery of questionnaires, and we first looked at the intercorrelations between questionnaires. And as you can probably see from this down here, from this table, intercorrelations were quite high in times across questionnaires. So that kind of reinforces the notion that we should indeed maybe not use single questionnaires to investigate our question of clinical symptoms here. So what we did instead, and that's also a similar approach, has been used several times before, So it's nothing that I came up with. But what we did instead was we actually did a factor analysis. So using dimensionality reduction approach, we extracted underlying clinical symptom dimensions. And namely, these were 3, capturing mood and anxiety symptoms, compulsive symptoms, and the third one rather being loading on social withdrawal or social anxiety items. When we now had a look at the choice and RT data and motivational biases, how that related to clinical symptoms, we actually saw quite different patterns for, on the one hand, both dimensions related more to the anxiety or depression spectrum relative to the compulsivity spectrum. And that's quite interesting here, maybe just as an explanation. I'm not plotting that dimensionally, but to make this pattern more obvious, I actually just plotted the highest and lowest tertiles of the dimension scores. So just for you as an explanation. What we can see here is actually a pattern that is quite interesting, because more anxious and depressed individuals, they're actually better on this task. And that's quite interesting, because usually we always see more symptoms, worse performance. So they are especially better on bias incongruent cues. So whenever they actually should go against the bias, that's actually what they do. So they're actually better at this. Meanwhile, when you look at the RT data, you also see an effect, namely that people who are more anxious and depressed, they're slower whenever they make an error or whenever they make an incorrect go response. There's also a difference for the go cues, but when you split it up, the effect is really driven by the no-go cues. Relative to that, when you look at the compulsivity data, it's quite a different pattern. So more compulsivity actually translates into worse performance overall. And it's not specific to any kind of cue in that regard. It's really like just worse performance overall. And looking at the RT data, again, you see a bit of a different effect, because here the main effect of RT is driven by the go cues. So people who are reporting more compulsive symptoms, they're actually slower for correct go responses. So they're worse and they're slower. So then, me coming from a lab that is mainly doing a lot with reinforcement learning models, we thought, well, maybe we could really try and explain why some people perform better and others perform worse on this task using RL models. So this is what we did next. So we used a base model that has been established before, and it's usually quite good at capturing the data from a go, no-go task, because it also can capture this motivational bias in the decision data that we see. And it usually has, well, it depends a bit, but usually it has a feedback sensitivity parameter, sometimes split up according to valence. It usually has a learning rate, a parameter for go bias, and one for the motivational bias. And given that especially our more depressed and anxious individuals are quite good at apparently at the bias incongruent trials, we thought, well, there must be a mechanism how they do that. And this is why previous work on the value of control came in, because we thought, given that some people have hypothesized that we can actually learn the value of executing cognitive control, so basically up and down regulated based on situational requirements, then maybe we should try and implement such a mechanism into our RL model to try and capture this phenomenon. And this is what we did. We implemented a value of control that could be learned by our participants. And this was actually regulating the extent of the bias being suppressed. So what we did for that was we defined for each cue, such as this go to avoid cue, but also for the other cues, whether, depending on what kind of response you showed and whether it was going against or was in line with the bias, whether that caused either a desirable or non-desirable outcome. And based on this combination, we defined for each given combination whether this should translate into a value of control going up, or for that matter, whether there were situations where you should actually like tune down on the control, because might actually come in handy to just go along with a bias. Also, again, within the RL modeling framework, what we did was also we implemented a control learning rate named gamma, and this was regulating by how much the value of control was updated on each try. And when we looked at the data or the model comparison, this is actually model 6, the control model. And so apparently this is a model which outperforms all the other models we tested. And just as a proof of concept, what I depict here is the strength of the bias across the task. So for whenever cues actually required a bias congruent action, so it was good to go with a bias, the bias strength was actually quite constant across the task, whereas the opposite holds true whenever cues actually required a bias incongruent action. So people here actually learned to tune down the bias, which was quite interesting. Finally, who learned to adjust the bias? So can we see that for more anxious individuals, for instance? And something that we see that more anxious and depressed individuals do express this control model more frequently. So there's not really one parameter that makes a difference here, but it's really like this model seems to capture the data or the data they produce more in a better way. Whereas for more compulsive individuals, we could actually really pinpoint it more to single parameters. So worse performance apparently was related to a decreased learning rate for more compulsive individuals, and to some extent, potentially to reduced feedback sensitivity. But again, you see that these effects are not linear, so it's not straightforward to interpret them. And given that I'm part of a symposium that actually is about sequential sampling models, I would have loved to present you some data already on a sequential sampling model. We're still in the process of doing that. So we are in the process of expanding this learning of control model using reinforcement learning DDMs, because that will definitely allow us to integrate both the RT and the choice effects. And that's really what we need, I think, for this kind of data set I just presented you with. And given the task nature being a reinforcement learning task, we definitely need the learning effects. So this is the outlook. I have some expectations in terms of what this could look like for more anxious and depressed individuals. So that it could be related to changes in the drift rate, could also be related to changes in the threshold, because they might behave more cautiously here. For the more compulsive individuals, I'm still a bit lost because they perform worse and they are slower. So it's not really a speed accuracy trade-off. But yeah, that needs to be seen. And I'm very happy if in the near future, I will be able to present you with the results from this endeavor. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm either happy to take questions now or later. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Vanessa. Not seeing any questions in the chat yet, but I guess I had one quick one about your way forward. So you're going to fit the DDM with the implicit boundary, the Gomez and Ratcliffe version?
Yeah, well, the thing is, we're actually looking into the best way to approach this, because given that the data set is quite big, right, with roughly 500 people, we're really looking at different options and how to best do that, because going Bayesian and hierarchical, that could really mean, in terms of CPU and really modeling and fitting the data, that could really be quite intense. So we're still looking at different options of how to do that best, and what kind of model could best capture the effects, right? So yeah, whenever you have suggestions for me in terms of that, I'm very happy for anything that could be of use here.
Okay, well, maybe we'll chat about that at the end in the last part, but I think we probably were on time nicely, so we should move on to Lawrence.